3,000 years ago, a truly global economy vanished almost overnight. The story of the rise and sudden fragmentation of interconnected Bronze Age economies is one of history's most startling collapses. By the end, you will understand how a world of dazzling complexity can shatter, and what fragile threads hold our own modern networks together. How did a system linking empires from Egypt to Afghanistan simply come apart? What does a sunken ship loaded with treasures tell us about a forgotten world? This journey through ancient letters, sunken ships, and silent ruins reveals a cautionary tale written in clay and bronze. When you look at our interconnected world today, what echoes of that ancient fragility do you sense? A network of trade and diplomacy stretched from the Nile Delta to the Aegean Sea. Around 1600 years before the Common Era, the major powers of the ancient world were not isolated fortresses. They were becoming deeply intertwined in a web of mutual dependence. To the south, the new kingdom of Egypt stood as a colossus of wealth and architectural ambition. To the north, in the rugged highlands of Anatolia, the Hittite Empire commanded formidable military power, its mastery of ironworking still a closely guarded secret. Across the wine-dark sea, the citadels of Mycenaean Greece, like Mycenae and Pylos, were hubs of vibrant culture and skilled craftsmanship. On the Syrian coast, the bustling port city of Ugarit thrived as a cosmopolitan trading hub, a place where languages and goods from a dozen lands mingled in its markets. And further east, the storied cities of Babylon and the rising power of Assyria anchored the Mesopotamian world. What bound these diverse and often rival kingdoms together was not a common government, but a shared need. The lifeblood of this emerging system was bronze. This alloy of copper and tin was the essential material for weapons, tools, and prestige objects. But here was the catch, the fundamental vulnerability. Copper deposits were scattered, but tin, the crucial hardening agent, was extraordinarily rare. Major sources were thousands of miles apart, in places like Anatolia, Afghanistan, and possibly as far west as Cornwall. No single kingdom controlled all the necessary ingredients. This simple fact of geology forced cooperation. It created an economic incentive so powerful that it overrode constant political tensions. To move these heavy, valuable commodities across such vast distances, two other technologies proved vital. Advanced sailing ships capable of braving the open Mediterranean replaced mere coast-hugging vessels. And the light, horse-drawn chariot revolutionized both warfare and, crucially, the speed of communication between royal courts. The result was a flow of more than just metal. Luxury goods like ivory, amber, glass, and finely crafted pottery sailed along these maritime highways. Diplomatic letters, written on clay tablets in a shared diplomatic language, traveled with them, weaving a fragile fabric of alliances and royal greetings. This was a world on the very brink of true globalization, where the prosperity of a pharaoh in Egypt could be subtly linked to the success of a mining operation in a distant, mountainous land. It was a brilliant, complex, and utterly fragile web, and its very success sowed the seeds for what was to come. The true power of that age was not held in palaces or by armies alone, but flowed in ingots of a reddish gold metal. Bronze was the lifeblood of civilization, as strategically essential as oil is in our modern world. This was not a single element but an alloy, a deliberate creation. Artisans would combine roughly 9 parts of copper with 1 part of tin to produce a material far superior to either metal alone. It was harder, held a sharper edge, and could be cast into intricate shapes. From the farmer's plowshare to the soldier's sword, from the ceremonial drinking cup to the grand statue of a god, bronze defined the possibilities of the era. But this miracle material came with a profound logistical challenge. The two ingredients were almost never found in the same place. Copper deposits were relatively widespread, with the island of Cyprus becoming so famous for its mines that the very word copper derives from its Latin name, Cyprium. But tin was a different story. It was vanishingly rare. To secure it, kingdoms had to look to the very edges of their known world. Evidence points to tin sources in the distant mountains of Afghanistan, a staggering journey overland through deserts and mountain passes. Other potential sources lay in Central Asia and even as far west as Cornwall at the remote tip of Britain. Just picture the journey of a single tin ingot. Mined in the rugged highlands of Afghanistan, it would be loaded onto donkeys or camels for a months-long trek across the Iranian plateau, down through Mesopotamia, perhaps to the great port of Ugarit on the Syrian coast. There it would be carefully weighed, taxed, and loaded onto a wooden ship alongside Cypriot copper. That ship would then brave the open Mediterranean, sailing past pirate-haunted coasts and through sudden storms, destined for a royal palace in Greece or Egypt. This was not simple commerce, it was a high-stakes enterprise that dictated foreign policy. No king could afford to be cut off from the tin supply. This absolute necessity bred a forced interdependency. A pharaoh in Egypt might have the gold, but he needed Hittite expertise or access to Anatolian silver. A Mycenaean wanax or king might command a fleet, but he relied on diplomatic agreements to ensure those copper ships kept arriving from Cyprus. Royal marriages were often less about romance and more about securing a reliable trade partner, weaving family ties into supply chain contracts. The entire glorious edifice of the late Bronze Age was built upon these thousands of miles of fragile threads stretched taut across deserts, mountains, and seas. The system's greatest strength, this deep interconnection, was also its hidden flaw. For if just one of those threads snapped, the whole magnificent tapestry could begin to unravel. This intricate web of trade was mirrored by an even more delicate dance of diplomacy. While merchants handled the bulk commodities, kings and pharaohs engaged in a high-stakes ritual that blended economics, politics, and theater. We know this from incredible archives of clay tablets, like the famous Amarna letters found in Egypt. These are not dry state documents. They are personal correspondence between the great rulers of the age, addressing each other as brother. The core of this relationship was the royal gift exchange. Imagine a convoy arriving at the palace of the Hittite king. It carries a message from the pharaoh, along with lavish presents, solid gold vessels, ebony furniture inlaid with ivory, bolts of the finest linen, and perhaps even highly skilled artisans, doctors, or musicians. This was not a simple act of generosity. It was a calculated political and economic transaction with multiple layers of meaning. On one level, it was a public display of wealth and power, a way for a ruler to say, "Look at the incredible resources I command." More importantly, it created a binding web of mutual obligation. To accept such a magnificent gift was to acknowledge the giver's status and to incur a debt. The recipient was now honor-bound to respond with a gift of equal or greater value at a later date. This cycle of giving and reciprocation forged alliances as strong as any treaty. It was a way to maintain a balance of power without constant warfare. A king might send 20 talents of pure lapis lazuli, not because his brother ruler needed it, but to reinforce their partnership and ensure continued access to that ruler's tin mines or military support. The system even extended to royal marriages, where daughters sent to foreign courts were accompanied by staggering dowries, effectively making them living, breathing gifts that tied two royal houses together. This entire elegant structure, however, relied on one fragile element: trust. The system demanded constant maintenance, a never-ending flow of letters and caravans to keep the relationships warm. If gifts went unacknowledged, or if a promised shipment of silver was replaced with one of inferior quality, it was not merely an insult, it was a seismic political event. A breakdown in these carefully choreographed rituals was a clear signal that the web of mutual obligation was fraying. When the gifts stopped flowing, it often meant that the underlying economic exchanges had already ground to a halt. The diplomacy of the gift was the glue holding the economic system together, and when that glue dried up, the entire political order began to crack. This reveals a profound truth about that ancient world, and perhaps about our own. Economics and politics were not separate spheres. They were two sides of the same carefully polished coin. But beneath the glittering exchange of royal gifts, the true weight of the system was carried on the shoulders of a different class entirely. While kings wrote letters, merchants kept the ledgers. They were the professional movers of goods, the indispensable grease for the wheels of this vast machine. Places like the port of Ugarit on the Syrian coast were not just political capitals, they were vibrant economic engines. Imagine the docks there, a cacophony of languages, the scent of cedar and spices, the shouts of stevedores unloading ingots of copper from Cyprus, while others loaded finely painted Mycenaean pottery onto ships bound for Egypt. This was the beating heart of the Bronze Age global economy. These merchants operated in a fascinating space. Some worked directly for the palace, managing royal monopolies on certain high-value goods like purple dye or precious metals. But many others were independent entrepreneurs, navigating a complex web of relationships that stretched beyond any single king's control. They acted as cultural intermediaries, carrying not just goods but ideas, technologies, and artistic styles from one civilization to another. To facilitate this complex trade, they developed sophisticated tools. Weighted pieces of silver became a widely accepted proto-currency, a major leap from simple barter. A merchant in Ugarit could use these silver bits to purchase grain in Canaan, knowing that same silver could later buy tin from a caravan arriving from the east. Standardized weights and measures, often certified by royal seals, brought a crucial element of trust to transactions across great distances. We even find evidence of early contractual agreements, etched in clay, detailing shipments, partnerships, and the settling of debts. Now picture the life of one such merchant. His name is lost, but his story is written in the risks he took. He might captain a small, sturdy ship, its hold packed with olive oil from Greece and luxury textiles. His journey from the Aegean to the Nile Delta was a gamble against the open sea, a 2-week voyage where a sudden storm could mean total loss. He navigated not only by the stars but by a mental map of political alliances, knowing which ports were friendly and which coastal rulers might demand exorbitant tariffs or worse. His success was measured in profit, but his role was far greater. By constantly moving commodities, he mitigated local shortages. A poor harvest in Anatolia could be offset by grain shipped from Egypt, thanks to networks these merchants maintained. They distributed goods so efficiently that a common style of pottery or a particular design for a sword could be found from Greece to the Levant. This level of private enterprise, thriving within a palace-dominated world, provided the system with its essential flexibility and resilience. The merchant was the linchpin, the human element that turned royal diplomacy into tangible, everyday abundance. Yet for all their skill, they were sailing a sea that was becoming increasingly treacherous, not from storms, but from something far more unpredictable. These routes were the superhighways of their day, invisible lines of commerce etched across sea and sand. Picture a map of the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. Snaking across the blue expanse of the sea were the maritime lifelines. Ships laden with Cypriot copper would sail north to the ports of Anatolia or west to the Aegean. From the Nile Delta, Egyptian grain and gold moved northward, while Aegean pottery and olive oil traveled in the opposite direction. This was not random travel, but a seasonal, predictable flow, following currents and winds that ancient captains knew intimately. Parallel to these sea lanes ran the great overland caravan routes. One critical path cut across the harsh Syrian desert, connecting the Mediterranean port of Ugarit with the mighty Euphrates River and the wealth of Mesopotamia. Here, donkeys and later camels carried tin from the east and textiles from Babylon, moving in endless, dusty caravans under a relentless sun. These two systems, maritime and overland, were not separate, they were interlocked. A tin ingot from Afghanistan might travel by land to Ugarit, only to be loaded onto a ship bound for Greece, its journey a hybrid of desert and deep water. At the crossroads of these routes sat the era's great hub cities, the ancient equivalents of Singapore or Rotterdam. Ugarit, on the Syrian coast, was a premier information clearinghouse, its archives of clay tablets detailing contracts, shipments, and diplomatic mail. The island of Cyprus, ancient Alaschia, was not just a stop but a massive industrial center. At cities like Economies, raw copper ore was smelted and cast into the iconic oxhide-shaped ingots that became the standard unit of trade across the Mediterranean. Further west, the Palace of Knossos on Crete served as a vital redistribution center for Aegean goods, its labyrinthine storerooms once packed with the wealth of the sea. The most breathtaking snapshot of this network in action isn't a map or a tablet, but a shipwreck. Off the rugged coast of southern Turkey lies the Uluburun ship, which sank in a storm around 1300 years before the Common Era. When archaeologists excavated its preserved cargo, they found a microcosm of the entire Bronze Age world. The hold contained 10 tons of Cypriot copper ingots, a ton of precious tin, ebony logs from Africa, ivory tusks, glass ingots from Mesopotamia, Mycenaean pottery, Canaanite jewelry, and even a golden scarab bearing the name of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti. This single vessel carried raw materials, manufactured luxuries, and royal gifts from at least 7 different cultures. It was a floating trade summit, a testament to the stunning density of these connections. This dense web provided incredible resilience for centuries, allowing goods to find alternative paths if one route was blocked by conflict or a poor harvest. But that same density created a hidden danger, a profound vulnerability. The system had become so interconnected, so efficient, that a serious disruption at any major node, whether a port city sacked by invaders or a critical mine failing, could send shockwaves pulsing through every linked kingdom. The web that enabled prosperity could also conduct catastrophe. A single shipwreck like Uluburun tells a story far deeper than commerce. Those copper ingots and golden scarabs were not just objects, they were vessels for something less tangible but far more transformative: ideas. When a Mycenaean drinking cup, decorated with scenes of chariots and hunting, was unloaded on the docks of an Egyptian city, it did more than hold wine. It carried with it an entire aesthetic, a way of seeing the world. This silent, constant exchange along the trade routes led to a remarkable phenomenon, a cultural cross-pollination that shaped the art, religion, and daily life of the entire region. Archaeologists find the evidence everywhere. In the tombs of Egyptian nobles, they uncover finely painted jars from Mycenaean Greece, prized as exotic luxuries. Far to the west, on the island of Sardinia, local metalworkers began producing bronze figurines and tools using distinctively Cypriot styles and techniques, a clear transfer of skill across 1,000 miles of sea. Perhaps most telling are the small, personal items. Egyptian scarabs, the beetle-shaped amulets symbolizing rebirth, have been found in Aegean graves. A Canaanite merchant living in the bustling port of Ugarit might own a cylinder seal from Mesopotamia, used to mark his possessions with images of gods he did not worship, but whose power he recognized. This blending went beyond mere imitation. It created a shared visual language for the elite, a kind of international style scholars call a coin. Imagine a king in Anatolia building a new palace. His artisans might incorporate Egyptian lotus motifs into the wall paintings, use Aegean-style columns in the courtyard, and furnish the rooms with furniture inlaid with ivory designs popular in Syria. To be modern, to be part of the civilized world, meant displaying this cosmopolitan taste. It signaled that you were connected, wealthy, and sophisticated. This cultural fusion even touched the dinner table. The spread of specific pottery shapes designed for olive oil and wine suggests that culinary habits and the social rituals of feasting began to converge across these different kingdoms. This shared elite culture fostered a sense of common identity among the ruling classes, a feeling that they were part of something larger than their own city walls. It smoothed diplomatic relations because when a Hittite prince saw an Egyptian gift, he understood its symbolism and value. Yet this very success could create a subtle tension. As the palaces from Greece to the Levant began to look and feel more similar, with their frescoed walls and imported luxuries, what happened to deeply local traditions? The vibrant, distinct artistic voices of individual regions could become muted, blended into the international style. For the common farmer or artisan, this elite cosmopolitanism might have felt distant, even alien. Their local gods, their traditional pottery designs, their own stories, existed in a different world from the imported splendor of the palace. This created an invisible fault line within these societies, a divide between a connected, globalized elite and a local population whose lives were rooted in the soil of their ancestors. In times of peace and plenty, this tension was manageable, a quiet background hum. But if the flow of goods and ideas that sustained that elite identity were to suddenly stop, what would fill the silence? The shared cultural language depended on the constant conversation of trade, and when that conversation faltered, the sense of a unified civilized world could shatter, leaving people to fall back on much older, much more local loyalties. The pinnacle of this interconnected world was not a battlefield but an archive room. Within the fortified palaces of Mycenaean Greece, in places like Pylos and Knossos, thousands of clay tablets baked in ancient fires preserve a stunning snapshot of a managed economy. These are the Linear B records, and they reveal a system of control so meticulous it feels startlingly modern. The palace was not just a royal residence, it was the central processor for the entire kingdom's economic life. Scribes working in quiet administrative wings tracked everything. They recorded the exact number of sheep in distant pastures, the precise amount of wool allotted to individual weaving workshops in the town, and the olive oil ration due to a specific bronze smith named Pylos. Every chariot wheel, every jar of perfumed oil, every measure of grain paid as tax to the palace was logged, categorized, and stored. This was a command economy on a grand scale. The palace collected raw materials and agricultural surplus from the surrounding countryside, then redistributed them to specialized workers, from perfume makers and armorers to weavers and masons. This centralization enabled incredible achievements. It allowed for true specialization, where an artisan could spend a lifetime perfecting the craft of inlaying ivory, supported by the system's surplus. It funded massive public works, the construction of cyclopean walls, vast drainage projects, and the great beehive tombs that still awe us today. The system was a masterpiece of optimization, but for one specific condition: stability. It was designed to function like a perfectly tuned clock in a predictable environment. Every cog, from the farmer to the scribe, had a designated place. This top-heavy control created immense efficiency, but also profound rigidity. The entire structure depended on the uninterrupted flow of information and goods along established channels. If the harvest was good and the trade routes open, the palace could store surplus against lean years and commission glorious art. But this complexity came at a cost. There was little room for local initiative or rapid adaptation. A village facing an unexpected shortage couldn't easily trade with a neighboring region. All surplus was destined for the palace storehouses. The system's greatest strength, its detailed, centralized planning, was also its fatal weakness. It was a magnificent but brittle machine engineered for a world that played by predictable rules. When those rules suddenly changed, the intricate bureaucracy had no contingency plan, no way to respond with the speed and flexibility a crisis would demand. The very records that detailed its success would soon become a ledger of its collapse. Even the most robust system whispers its distress before it screams. The first cracks in the late Bronze Age world did not appear as shattered palaces, but in the anxious words of kings and the silent testimony of stone. In the royal archives, the tone of the diplomatic letters begins to shift. A message from the king of Ugarit to the ruler of Alashiya, Cyprus, is no longer a flowery greeting but a desperate plea. He writes of his ships being harassed, his merchants unable to travel safely. Another tablet reveals a request from the Hittite court to Egypt, an urgent appeal for a shipment of grain to stave off famine in their lands. These are not the confident exchanges of brothers, but the transactions of partners under mounting strain. The system's lifeblood, the predictable flow of goods and people, was becoming dangerously erratic. Safety could no longer be assumed on the open seas or the caravan trails, hinting at a breakdown of the royal authority that had once guaranteed safe passage. This wasn't just about piracy, it was a sign that the web of mutual obligation was fraying at the edges, that local powers were no longer willing or able to uphold the rules of the international order. At the same time, from Greece to the Levant, a new kind of construction project began. Archaeologists digging through the layers of the 13th century before the Common Era find a consistent story written in stone and brick. Massive new fortification walls rise around once open cities. Palaces that were once centers of administration and luxury begin to look more like fortresses. Gateways are narrowed and reinforced. At sites like Mycenae, the famous Lion Gate is constructed, a monumental and intimidating entrance through walls so thick they were later thought to be built by giants. This surge in defensive architecture tells us one thing clearly: the people of that age felt a growing, pervasive threat. They were investing their dwindling resources not in new temples or trade fleets, but in sheer survival, battening down the hatches against a gathering storm they could sense but perhaps not yet name. Meanwhile, the very earth itself seemed to turn against them. Scientists studying climate proxies like tree rings and sediment cores from the region find evidence of a prolonged period of drier, more unpredictable weather beginning around this time. Several years of severe drought could devastate the agricultural base of any kingdom. A failed harvest meant no surplus grain to trade, no surplus to feed the specialized palace workers, and no means to fulfill those urgent royal requests for emergency food aid. The intricate, just-in-time system of redistribution, so brilliant in times of plenty, had no slack for such shocks. A local drought could now trigger a regional crisis, as kingdoms that once relied on each other's surplus found their pantries empty at the same time. Individually, any one of these stresses, merchant insecurity, political mistrust, or a few bad harvests, might have been absorbed by a resilient society. But together they acted like constant pressure on a single point in a complex machine. The metal of civilization was being stressed, bent, and fatigued. Each complaint in a clay tablet, each new course added to a city wall, was a tiny fracture propagating through the structure. The glorious peak was past, and the long, slow descent had begun, a process where the very connections that created wealth began to transmit scarcity and fear with terrifying efficiency. Then came the storm from the sea. The most dramatic actors in the final act of this collapse are figures shrouded in mystery, known only by the name given to them by their victims, the Sea Peoples. Egyptian temple walls at Medinet Habu tell a stark story. Grand stone reliefs commissioned by Pharaoh Rameses III show a chaotic naval battle, with Egyptian archers firing from sleek ships upon vessels filled with warriors wearing distinctive feathered headdresses. The inscriptions boast of a great victory, of repelling a confederation of foreign lands that had moved across the eastern Mediterranean, overthrowing kingdoms and leaving smoldering cities in their wake. The pharaoh lists their exotic names, the Peliset, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, names that echo with unknown origins. For a long time, history books presented this as the clear cause of the collapse, a tidal wave of barbarian invaders that swept away the old order. But modern archaeology reveals a far more complex and interesting picture. The destruction they are blamed for is real. From the burning of the great trading city of Ugarit, whose final desperate plea for help was found still in the oven, to the sacking of coastal strongholds in Cyprus and Canaan, a wave of violent destruction rippled across the region in the early 12th century before the Common Era. Yet the timing is crucial. These attacks did not happen to a healthy, thriving network. They struck a system already reeling from drought, famine, and internal political paralysis. The Sea Peoples did not cause the initial illness. They attacked a body already running a high fever. So who were they? The evidence suggests they were likely not a single, coordinated army, but a mixed multitude. Some groups may indeed have been opportunistic raiders from the Aegean or Anatolia, classic pirates drawn to the wealth of a weakened civilization. Others, however, show signs of being entire communities on the move. Archaeologists find that in the ashes of cities like Ugarit, new and different styles of pottery, architecture, and weapons appear immediately after the destruction, indicating that the destroyers did not just loot and leave but settled in. This points to a desperate migration, not merely an invasion. Picture families, not just warriors, sailing in anything that could float, displaced from their own homelands perhaps by the same climate shifts and crop failures that were crippling the great kingdoms. They were likely both a symptom of the wider systemic collapse and a powerful accelerant of it. As they moved along the coasts, they severed the vital maritime trade routes, the very arteries of the Bronze Age world. A king could no longer send his grain to an ally, nor receive the tin needed to equip his army. The Sea Peoples acted as the final, brutal shock to a system already in multiple organ failure. They were less the cause of death and more the catastrophic event that finally stopped a faltering heart. This reframes the entire collapse. It moves us from a simple story of them versus us to a tragic cascade, where a confluence of environmental stress, economic brittleness, and social fragmentation created a vacuum of power, and into that vacuum surged the desperate and the ruthless. The civilized world did not just fall to an outside force, it crumbled from within, and the storm from the sea simply carried away the pieces. The unraveling began not with a single blow, but a cascade of failures. Around 1200 years before the Common Era, the interconnected system reached a tipping point, and the collapse spread with terrifying speed. It was a domino effect where the fall of one kingdom pulled down its neighbors, severing the threads of the network one by one. Deep in the Anatolian highlands, the mighty Hittite capital of Hattusa was not sacked by a foreign army, but eerily abandoned. Its massive granaries, once filled with enough grain to feed thousands, were left empty. The royal archives were carefully buried, a final act of preservation by a people who knew they would not return. The central authority that commanded an empire simply evaporated, leaving scattered cities to face an uncertain future alone. Across the Aegean, the brilliant palaces of the Mycenaean world went dark. At Pylos, the administrative heart of a kingdom, tablets record the deployment of watchers to the coast, a last-minute effort to guard against a threat from the sea. It was not enough. The palace was burned, its intricate bureaucracy silenced forever in the fire that baked its clay records. The citadel of Mycenae, with its legendary Lion Gate, shrank from a thriving political center to a small, fortified refuge clinging to a hilltop. The complex redistribution economy, that clockwork machine of scribes and storerooms, ceased to function entirely. On the coast of Syria, the vibrant port of Ugarit sent one final, frantic message. A tablet found in its ruins, addressed to the king of Alatia on Cyprus, pleads for awareness of an imminent danger, stating that the enemy's ships are already here and that the city is burning. The reply never came, and the city was utterly destroyed, its role as a cosmopolitan hub ending in ash and silence. Even the great power of Egypt, which repelled direct attacks, could not hold its network together. It lost its grip on its valuable territories in the Levant, retracting its influence back to the Nile Valley and severing a critical link in the overland trade routes. This was not a slow decline over centuries. The core of this international system disintegrated over just a few decades, a blink of an eye in historical terms. What emerges from the archaeology is a picture of near-total systemic failure. The palatial centers, those engines of economic and cultural life, did not transform, they vanished. Literacy, monumental architecture, and specialized artisanal production largely disappeared from the Greek mainland and Anatolia for centuries. It was a staggering loss of complexity, a reversion to a smaller, simpler, and more isolated way of life. The world did not end, but the world they knew certainly did. The vast, interconnected sphere shrank back into scattered, isolated pockets, each community now left to fend for itself in a landscape where the old rules no longer applied and the roads no longer led to friendly palaces. The collapse was so total it even stole the words from their mouths and the records from their hands. One of the most profound markers of this fragmentation is the eerie silence that fell over the administrative heart of these kingdoms, the sudden disappearance of complex writing systems. In the ruins of the Mycenaean palaces, the linear B script used for centuries to track flocks of sheep and distributions of bronze was never written again. The knowledge of how to form those intricate syllabic signs vanished with the last palace scribes. Across the sea in Anatolia, the distinctive Anatolian hieroglyphs that adorned monuments and the imported cuneiform script used for diplomatic treaties fell into complete disuse. Even on trade-rich Cyprus, the local Cypriot syllabic script, used to write the ancient Greek spoken on the island, faded away. Literacy, once a tool of power and commerce across this interconnected world, retreated to just a few resilient holdouts, primarily in the cores of Assyria and Egypt. This was not merely the end of bureaucratic record-keeping. It represented a catastrophic rupture in the very continuity of civilization. Imagine a society where no one could any longer read the tax records, the building plans for the aqueduct, the treaties with neighboring kings, or the inventories of the royal granary. The collective memory stored in those clay tablets and stone inscriptions was effectively erased. The ability to coordinate complex projects across time and space, to transmit detailed knowledge beyond the lifetime of a single individual, that capacity was severely diminished. The high culture sustained by the palace economies, with its specialized poets, architects, and diplomats, lost its primary medium. What followed in regions like Greece and Anatolia is often called a dark age, not because people were inherently less intelligent, but because the historical record becomes incredibly thin and difficult for us to read. The silence of the scribes signifies a staggering regression in social complexity. Communities became smaller, more localized, and necessarily more focused on immediate survival than on maintaining the intricate systems of their ancestors. For historians, this period is a puzzle with most of the pieces missing, a story told almost entirely through archaeology, through the silent language of pottery shards, abandoned settlements, and simpler graves. The loss of writing meant the loss of their own detailed voice, making the centuries after the collapse a whispering gallery where we strain to hear the echoes of a world that had forgotten how to write its own name. The silence left by the scribes was matched by an even deeper emptiness across the landscape. In the wake of the collapse, a profound transformation reshaped where and how people lived, a phenomenon archaeologists call the Great Abandonment. The bustling, interconnected urban centers that had pulsed with life for centuries now stood hollow. Cities like Hattusa in Anatolia were not just damaged, they were completely deserted, their streets reclaimed by wind and weeds. In Greece, the archaeological record tells a startling story of depopulation. Surveys of the countryside show that up to 9 out of every 10 settlements simply vanished. The population in some regions may have fallen by a staggering 90%. This wasn't a gradual relocation, it was a demographic catastrophe. The grand palatial model, with its dense population supported by complex trade, had utterly failed and people voted with their feet. So where did everyone go? The survivors didn't disappear, they adapted in the only way that made sense for a broken world. They moved away from the exposed, lowland plains and coastal cities that were now vulnerable to raiding. Instead, they sought out remote, easily defensible locations, steep hilltops, hidden valleys, and rocky promontories. These new settlements were not designed for commerce or administration, but for sheer survival. They were small, often just a few families, and they were overwhelmingly focused on one thing: subsistence-level farming. Life reverted to a much simpler, more localized rhythm. A community on a Grecian hilltop would grow just enough grain to feed itself, tend a few goats, and perhaps maintain a small pottery kiln for basic utensils. The specialized crafts of the palace workshops, the intricate metalworking, the fresco painting, the administration of vast estates, those skills were no longer in demand because the economic system that required them was gone. This massive shift from urban interdependence to rural isolation had a cascading effect. It dismantled the engine of the Bronze Age economy from the ground up. With so few people living in cities, there was no large, concentrated population to produce an agricultural surplus for trade. With everyone focused on growing their own food, there were far fewer full-time artisans to create luxury goods for export. And with communities now separated by distrust and difficult terrain, the demand for long-distance trade in essentials like tin and copper evaporated. Why risk a dangerous journey for bronze when your immediate concern was having enough seed for next year's harvest? The Great Abandonment was the final, quiet verdict on the old system. The population didn't collapse because the trade networks failed. The trade networks failed irrevocably because the population that sustained them had scattered and turned inward. The glittering, globalized world of the late Bronze Age depended on a critical mass of people living and working together in complexity. When that mass dissolved into thousands of isolated, self-sufficient pockets, the world itself seemed to shrink, leaving behind empty palaces as monuments to a forgotten scale of human ambition. The story of the collapse is incomplete without understanding the ground itself and what it could no longer provide. Paleoclimatology, the science of ancient weather, has uncovered a silent culprit in the final act. By analyzing layers of sediment at the bottom of ancient lakes, the pollen preserved in peat bogs, and the slow-growing rings inside cave stalagmites, researchers have pieced together a stark picture. The Eastern Mediterranean, during the very decades the palaces were falling, was gripped by a severe and prolonged mega-drought. This was not a single dry season, but a relentless pattern spanning generations, where rainfall became scarce and unpredictable. For societies built on the foundation of grain and pasture, this was a slow-motion catastrophe. Imagine a farmer in the Hittite heartland, watching the spring rains fail not once but for 3 years in a row. The wheat withers in the field before it can form heads. The water sources for his livestock shrink to muddy puddles. His family's carefully stored surplus from better years is slowly consumed, with no hope of replenishment. This scenario, repeated across thousands of farms, triggered a cascade of failure. Consecutive crop collapses meant no surplus grain to send to the palace storehouses. Without that grain, the palace could not feed its army of scribes, artisans, and soldiers. It could not fulfill its sacred duty to provide for the people in lean times, eroding its very legitimacy. The loss of pasture forced herders to slaughter their flocks or move them in desperate, chaotic migrations, often onto cultivated land, creating conflict between farmers and herders. Famine became a political force. We see it in the desperate Hittite letters begging Egypt for emergency grain shipments. A kingdom famed for its military might was brought to its knees not by swords but by empty granaries. This climatic shift acted as a universal threat multiplier. It made already tense diplomatic relations more brittle, as every kingdom hoarded what little it had. It pushed populations to migrate in search of food, potentially adding to the chaotic movements of those called the Sea Peoples. It strained the social contract to the breaking point, as people asked why the gods and the king who was their representative had allowed this to happen. The intricate, just-in-time system of the Bronze Age had been engineered for a stable climate. It had no resilience built in for a world where the rains simply did not come. The drought did not cause the collapse by itself, but it systematically weakened every pillar of society, turning manageable stresses into existential crises. In the end, the greatest vulnerability was not in their walls or their treaties, but in their dependence on a predictable sky. When the sky withheld its bounty for too long, the entire magnificent structure, already fatigued, found it had been built on dust. A society's greatest threat can sometimes be the fault lines within its own walls. While drought and invasion battered the palace gates, a deeper, quieter crisis may have been eroding the foundations from inside. The palatial system, for all its glittering achievements, was built on a foundation of profound inequality. Wealth and power were concentrated in the hands of a tiny elite, the king, his family, high priests, and a small circle of administrators and military commanders. They lived in frescoed palaces, wore imported linens, and dined from gold and silver vessels, their status maintained by a complex ideology that tied their rule to the will of the gods. The vast majority of the population, the farmers, herders, and laborers, lived a very different life. Their surplus fed the system, their labor built its monuments, and their compliance kept the machine running. This social contract worked as long as the palace fulfilled its central promise, security and redistribution. In good years, the palace storehouses would provide a buffer against hunger, and the king's armies would keep the trade routes and farmlands safe. But what happens when that promise is broken? When consecutive droughts meant the storehouses were empty, and when the king's soldiers could no longer stop raids on coastal villages, why would a starving farmer remain loyal to a distant ruler in a hilltop citadel? The legitimacy of the entire elite class rested on their ability to manage the relationship between the people and the divine, to ensure the rains came and the harvests were plentiful. When the rains failed for a generation, that legitimacy evaporated. We find subtle but telling clues in the bones of the people themselves. Studies of skeletal remains from the late Bronze Age across Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean show increased signs of nutritional stress and periods of illness, particularly among the non-elite populations. This suggests that the burdens of scarcity were not borne equally. While the palace elites might have held onto their reserves a little longer, the common people bore the brunt of the hardship. In such an atmosphere, the social glue that held the hierarchy together would have dissolved into resentment and distrust. Archaeologists find intriguing hints of this internal fracture. At some sites, there is evidence that palaces were not just burned by outside attackers, but deliberately and systematically destroyed from within, with fires set in specific administrative areas. Could this point to popular uprisings, a final, furious rejection of a ruling class that had failed in its most basic duties? Other evidence suggests a quieter but equally devastating form of collapse, a simple withdrawal of support. People may have just walked away, abandoning the cities and the palatial centers to return to a simpler, more autonomous life in scattered villages, effectively opting out of a broken contract. The collapse then was not merely an economic or military failure, it was a seismic social event. The center, represented by the godlike king and his lavish court, could no longer hold. The story shifts from one of empires falling to invaders to one of communities deciding, whether through violence or quiet exodus, that the old deal was off. When the gift stopped flowing from the palace, the loyalty stopped flowing back to it. The true fragmentation may have begun not with the shattering of city gates, but with the breaking of 1,000 individual promises between the rulers and the ruled. The splendor of the Bronze Age was not just in its politics, but in its craft. The intricate art and advanced technologies that defined that era required something we easily overlook: a vast and stable support system. When the palaces fell and the trade routes went silent, that support system vanished overnight. The result was a profound technological and artistic regression, a simplification of the entire material world. One of the most telling signs is what happened to bronze itself. This metal, the very namesake of the age, became exceedingly rare. With the tin trade severed, new bronze could hardly be produced. People began to recycle existing objects on a massive scale, melting down heirlooms and tools to make new, often cruder implements. The quality plummeted. Where once a warrior might carry a sword with a finely balanced blade and an ornate hilt, now he might have a simple, utilitarian dagger patched together from older pieces. The Age of Bronze was ending not with a bang, but with the quiet, persistent sound of metal being melted down again and again, each time losing a little more of its former glory. The vibrant arts fostered by the palaces suffered a similar fate. The skill of fresco painting, of covering walls with vivid scenes of processions, griffins, and bull leaping, disappeared entirely in regions like Greece and Anatolia. The knowledge of how to prepare the plaster, mix the mineral pigments, and execute the designs died with the last palace artisans. Monumental stone architecture, the construction of tholos tombs and fortified gateways with colossal stone blocks ceased. Communities no longer had the collective labor, the specialized engineers, or the need for such grand statements of power. They were building for defense and necessity, not for eternity. Even everyday pottery tells the story of loss. The fine, wheel-made, exquisitely painted pottery styles of the Mycenaean and Minoan worlds, often depicting elaborate marine life or geometric patterns, gave way to simpler, hand-made vessels. The new pottery was functional, plain, and locally produced, with little of the regional flair or technical sophistication of before. This was not a change in fashion, it was a loss of technique. The potter's wheel itself fell out of use in many areas, a symbolic step backward in manufacturing. This widespread simplification is a classic signature of what historians call a systems collapse. Innovation and high-level craft are not automatic products of human ingenuity. They are flowers that bloom only in specific conditions. They require surplus resources to support full-time specialists. They require stable trade to supply exotic materials. They require a cultural ecosystem that values and commissions such work. When that entire ecosystem disintegrated, the specialized knowledge it sustained simply dissipated. There was no school to pass it on, no patron to pay for it, no market to demand it. A master fresco painter in a world of crumbling palaces would have had to become a farmer to survive, and his unique life's work would die with him. This backslide carries a humbling, powerful lesson. Human progress is not a one-way street. Complex societies can and do move backward. The arc of history does not always bend toward greater complexity. Sometimes it fractures, and the pieces reassemble into something smaller and simpler. The silence after the Bronze Age collapse is heard not only in the lack of written words, but in the quiet, plainer artifacts left behind, a material testament to a world that forgot how to make what it once could. The collapse was not a uniform blanket of darkness. While the great powers crumbled, flickers of light persisted in unexpected places, communities that not only survived but laid the groundwork for the world to come. Along the narrow coastal strip of the Levant, the Phoenician cities of Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon tell a story of remarkable resilience. Unlike the massive inland empires, these were not vast territorial kingdoms dependent on taxing a sprawling hinterland. They were nimble, mercantile city-states, their fortunes tied to the sea rather than the palace granary. When the overland trade routes faltered and the great powers retreated, the Phoenicians adapted. They shifted their focus, turning their renowned shipbuilding skills toward exploring new maritime horizons westward across the Mediterranean. Their survival hints at a crucial lesson. A less centralized, more network-based economy could bend where a rigid, top-heavy system would break. They became the essential bridge, carrying fragments of Bronze Age knowledge and technology into the emerging Iron Age. Inland, on the plains of Syria and the highlands of Anatolia, a different kind of survivor emerged. From the ashes of the Hittite Empire, a constellation of smaller, so-called Neo-Hittite and Aramean states arose. These were not revivals of the old imperial order, but something new and more modest. They were often hybrid kingdoms, blending remnants of Hittite culture with new populations and simpler political structures. Their power was regional, not international. They built smaller citadels, not monumental capitals, and their art shows a fascinating mix of old imperial styles and fresh local influences. Their existence proves that political fragmentation did not mean cultural extinction, it meant transformation. Even in Greece, the heartland of the palatial collapse, there were pockets of continuity. Athens, notably, was never completely abandoned. Its Acropolis remained a place of habitation and worship. While it shrank dramatically and lost its connections to the wider world, the thread of life there was never fully severed. This allowed it to become a crucial seedbed for later recovery. So what separated these survivors from the fallen giants? Was it simply luck, being in a place with slightly more reliable rainfall? Perhaps it was a matter of structure. The survivors often lacked the immense, vulnerable administrative overhead of a Mycenaean palace or a Hittite imperial court. They were smaller, more self-reliant, and could make decisions quickly without consulting a distant bureaucracy. Their economies were often more diversified or based on mobile wealth like herds or ships, which are harder for a crisis to completely obliterate than a fixed agricultural system. Their persistence rewrites the narrative of the collapse. It was not an absolute end, but a brutal, world-altering filter. It selected for flexibility over sheer size, for adaptability over rigid control. The societies that made it through were not the strongest in the old sense. They were the most capable of letting go of a dying world and learning to navigate the stark, fragmented landscape that was left behind. The world did not end with the silence of the scribes, but it was profoundly reborn from its own ashes. Out of the fragmentation, a new order slowly emerged, and its foundation was a different metal, one that changed the very logic of power. Iron, unlike the rare and distant tin that had dictated the alliances of kings, iron ore was remarkably common. You could find it in hillsides and bogs across the Mediterranean world from Italy to Anatolia. This simple geological fact was revolutionary. It meant a community was no longer held hostage by a trade route thousands of miles long. A village smith could now produce serviceable tools and weapons from local sources, reducing that crippling strategic dependency on fragile, long-distance networks. The Age of Bronze was defined by centralized control of scarce resources. The Age of Iron would be shaped by the decentralization of a plentiful one. The new states that grew in this landscape reflected this shift. They were often smaller, sharper, and more competitive than the sprawling Bronze Age kingdoms. Think of the emerging Israelite tribes uniting in the highlands of Canaan, not around a single opulent palace, but around a shared story and a covenant. On the coast, the Phoenician city-states like Tyre thrived not as imperial capitals, but as agile, network-based trading hubs, their power flowing through maritime connections rather than control of vast farmland. And later, in the rocky peninsula of Greece, the polis, the city-state, would become the defining unit. These were communities where political power, while still often held by elites, was more distributed, more contested, and closer to the people. The monolithic palace bureaucracy was gone, and in its absence, space opened up for experimentation. This competitive, decentralized environment became a furnace for innovation. Without a single royal authority dictating all terms, different communities tried different solutions to the problems of order and survival. In warfare, the old model of the aristocratic charioteer, a symbol of palatial wealth, gave way to the hoplite phalanx in Greece. This was a formation of heavily armed citizen farmers fighting shoulder to shoulder. Their strength derived from cohesion and shared purpose, not just elite patronage. It was a military revolution born from a social one. In economics, the old system of weighed silver bits and palace-controlled redistribution gradually saw the invention of true coinage in Lydia and Ionia, a technology that further empowered independent merchants and market exchanges beyond royal control. And in politics, this fragmentation and competition eventually allowed for the unthinkable to be tried in places like Athens, early forms of democracy and citizen participation, however limited by our standards. These were not mere improvements on the old system, they were fundamentally new ways of organizing human society. The brutal collapse of the Bronze Age had, in a sense, cleared the ground. It burned away the old, top-heavy model that had become too rigid to adapt. What grew back was hardier, more resilient because it was rooted in local realities and forced to be flexible. The new paradigm was not about maintaining a single, fragile web of interdependence across continents, but about building countless smaller, stronger networks that could withstand a shock without bringing everything down. The phoenix that rose was not a recreation of what was lost, but something adapted to a world where the old certainties had vanished. The legacy of the collapse was this harsh but fertile space, where the very breakdown of a globalized system made room for the seeds of our own world to first take root. That profound shift from palaces to villages was not forgotten. The trauma of the collapse was too vast to simply vanish from memory, and so it lived on, not in royal annals, but in the stories people told around fires for generations. These tales, shaped and reshaped by time, became the foundational myths of new civilizations, carrying the emotional and narrative residue of a real, shattered world. One of the most powerful echoes can be heard in the epic of the Trojan War. For centuries, scholars dismissed the conflict as pure legend. Yet, archaeology at the site of Hisarlik in northwest Turkey reveals a grand, wealthy city that was indeed destroyed by fire and war around the time of the broader collapse. This city, likely called Wilusa in Hittite records, was a key ally of the Hittite Empire. Its fall would have been a seismic event, the destruction of a glittering, cosmopolitan hub. The Homeric epics, written down centuries later, speak of a decade-long siege by a coalition of Greek kings, of fallen heroes like Achilles and Hector, and of a magnificent city laid low. The story preserves the memory of a lost age of splendor and of a cataclysmic war that brought an era to an end, a poetic reflection of the historical collapse of the entire Anatolian political order. Across the Mediterranean, another set of ancient texts holds possible echoes. The Hebrew Bible contains stories like the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan. While not literal history, these narratives may preserve folk memories of the chaotic power vacuum left in the Levant after Egyptian and Hittite influence retreated. The tales of wandering tribes, of battles to settle new lands, and of crumbling city walls could reflect the real experiences of population movements and the struggle for territory in that fragmented century. They are a cultural memory of navigating a world where the old giants had fallen. Even the Greeks themselves had a clear memory that a greater age had preceded their own. They spoke of a lost age of heroes, a time of demigods and mighty kings that came before a dim and less glorious period. This aligns strikingly with the archaeological reality, a brilliant late Bronze Age palatial world followed by centuries of simpler, isolated life. These myths are not factual records, but they are profound human documents. They represent the attempt to make sense of a catastrophic break in time, to explain where the magnificent ruins on the hilltops came from, and to find meaning in the descent from grandeur to hardship. The stories gave the chaos a shape, a cast of characters, and a moral dimension. They transformed a bewildering system's collapse into a narrative of heroic struggle, divine testing, and the enduring human spirit. In this way, the true end of the Bronze Age did not come with the last ember dying in a palace hearth. It came when the last person who had lived through it passed away, and the event ceased to be a lived memory and became instead a story, the first layer of history laid over the silent stones. The echoes of that ancient collapse are not trapped in the past. They resonate with an uncanny familiarity in the world we inhabit today. The late Bronze Age offers us history's first detailed case study of a globalized system failure, and its lessons are not about predicting doom, but about understanding profound vulnerability. Our modern civilization is built upon networks of staggering complexity. We rely on just-in-time supply chains that span oceans, delivering everything from microchips to medicine, mirroring the ancient world's absolute dependence on those long, fragile threads of tin and copper. A single container ship stuck in a canal or a disruption at a key port can send ripples of shortage through the entire global economy, a direct parallel to a storm sinking a single copper-laden ship off Uluburun. Our intricate financial systems, with their derivatives and instant digital transactions, create a web of mutual obligation and risk that rivals the dense interdependency of the palatial redistributive economies. A crisis in one sector can rapidly spread to others, much like a drought in Anatolia triggered famine and political appeals in Egypt, and looming over it all is a shared environmental challenge. Today, we face our own climate shifts, not a mega-drought perhaps, but rising seas, extreme weather, and resource stresses that threaten the stability of the very systems we depend on. The core lesson from 3,000 years ago is not that collapse is inevitable, but that hyper-complex, deeply interconnected systems carry within them a hidden danger, what experts now term systemic risk. This is the danger that a failure in one part of the system can trigger a cascade of failures elsewhere, overwhelming the system's ability to cope. The Bronze Age world was optimized for efficiency and grandeur under stable conditions, but it had little slack, little redundancy. When multiple stresses converged, its brilliant design became a trap. This ancient mirror urges us to ask critical questions about our own priorities. Have we, in our pursuit of lean optimization and maximum short-term efficiency, sacrificed long-term resilience? The survivors of the collapse were not the most efficient empires, but the most adaptable communities, the Phoenician traders and scattered villages that could pivot and endure. For us, building resilience might mean valuing redundancy, having backup systems and diverse supply sources, even if they are less cost-effective in the quiet times. It means prioritizing sustainability over relentless extraction, recognizing that environmental health is not separate from economic and political health. It challenges the notion that complexity alone is a mark of progress, reminding us that simplicity and local capacity are vital shock absorbers. This is not a call to abandon our interconnected world, but to see it with clear eyes, to fortify its weak points, and to remember that the strength of a network is found not only in its connections, but in the ability of its individual nodes to stand when the connections falter. The silent ruins of Hattusa and the burned tablets of Pylos are more than archaeological sites. They are a cautionary tale written across centuries, asking us what we are doing today to ensure our own story has a different ending. Reconstructing this ancient collapse feels like detective work across millennia. How can we possibly know the details of events from over 3,000 years ago, of droughts and shipwrecks and abandoned cities? The answer lies in a toolbox of modern scientific and historical methods, each one adding a piece to a vast, unfinished puzzle. The first and most fundamental clue is the ground itself. Archaeologists carefully excavate sites layer by layer, a technique called stratigraphy. Think of it as reading a history book where the pages are made of soil, ash, and rubble. A thick, dark layer of ash and burned mud brick tells a clear story of a violent fire. Below it, a level filled with everyday pottery and tools shows life as it was. Below that, perhaps the foundations of an earlier, grander building. By meticulously recording the sequence of these layers, experts can build a relative timeline of construction, destruction, and rebuilding at a single site, placing the final catastrophic fire in its proper sequence. But to connect the fires at Ugarit, Hattusa, and Mycenae, we need absolute dates. That is where natural clocks come in. The development of radiocarbon dating was a revolution. All living things absorb a tiny, predictable amount of radioactive carbon-14. When a plant or animal passes, this clock starts ticking down as the carbon decays. By measuring the remaining amount in a charred seed, a piece of wood, or even a bone from a destruction layer, scientists can calculate a range of years for when that organism lived. To make this timeline even more precise, researchers use dendrochronology, the study of tree rings. In regions with distinct wet and dry seasons, each year adds one ring to a tree. The pattern of wide rings in good years and narrow rings in drought years is unique, like a fingerprint. By matching the ring pattern from an ancient timber in a palace roof to a master chronology built from thousands of trees, archaeologists can often pinpoint the exact year that tree was cut down. This is how we know the Uluburun ship sank around 1300 years before the Common Era, and how we can trace the progression of regional droughts with astonishing accuracy. Then there are the messages left behind, waiting for their code to be cracked. For decades, the linear bead tablets from the Mycenaean palaces were silent mysteries. Then, in the 1950s, a young architect named Michael Ventris made a breakthrough. He theorized and then proved that the script was used to write an early form of Greek. Suddenly, lists of chariot wheels and women textile workers spoke across the ages, not of myths, but of tax receipts and palace logistics. This decipherment transformed our understanding, proving the Mycenaeans were Greek speakers and revealing the astonishing bureaucracy that underpinned their world. It turned dry inventory lists into some of our most vital testimonies of the collapse itself, like the final tablet from Pylos mentioning watchers on the coast. Today, the detective work goes even deeper to the atomic level. Isotope analysis allows scientists to read the chemical signature within objects. The lead isotopes in a copper ingot are like a geological passport, often traceable to specific mining regions like Cyprus. The strontium isotopes in a person's tooth enamel are set by the local geology of their childhood, revealing if an individual found in an Egyptian tomb grew up drinking water from the Nile or somewhere far away. This technology lets us map ancient trade routes and human movements with a precision our predecessors could only dream of, proving the incredible distances goods and people traveled. Our understanding is never static. It is a living narrative constantly revised by new evidence. A single discovery, like a previously unknown shipwreck with a unique cargo, can force us to redraw our maps of trade. A newly translated diplomatic letter can upend our view of an alliance. A deep ice core drilled from a Greenland glacier containing microscopic dust from ancient droughts can rewrite our timeline of environmental stress. This is the dynamic, thrilling nature of historical inquiry. We are not simply reading a story written in stone, we are assembling it piece by fragile piece, with each generation of scholars bringing new tools and new questions to the silent evidence. The past is not a closed book but an ongoing conversation, and every answer we find seems to open three more fascinating mysteries. The collapse left behind a haunting silence, but also a vibrant chorus of unanswered questions. Even with our advanced tools, the end of the Bronze Age remains a profound historical puzzle, its pieces still being fitted together. The biggest debates among scholars are not about minor details, but about the very heart of the event. What ultimately was the primary cause? Was it the relentless drought, a climatic hammer blow that shattered agricultural foundations? Or was it the internal social fracture, the revolt of the many against a privileged few who failed them? Perhaps it was the inherent brittleness of that top-heavy economic system, so efficient yet so fragile. The prevailing view today is that it was a perfect storm, a convergence of all these stresses where each one amplified the others. Yet the debate continues over which factor was the true spark, the one that turned a crisis into a catastrophe. This leads directly to the era's most enigmatic figures, the Sea Peoples. Were they a coordinated invading force, a mass migration of displaced families, or something in between? New archaeological finds suggest they were likely a complex mix of raiders, refugees, and migrants, but their precise origins and motivations remain one of history's great cold cases. Another enduring mystery lies in the fate of knowledge itself. Why did complex writing vanish entirely in Greece and Anatolia for centuries, while it persisted, albeit in diminished form, in places like Assyria? Was it a deliberate rejection of a failed system's tools, or simply the loss of the specialized scribble class that sustained it? The answer tells us about the depth of the collapse and whether it was a political or a civilizational ending. We also debate the very speed of the event. Was it a rapid 50-year unraveling, a series of sudden connected disasters, or was it a slower 2-century decline, a long twilight where the lights went out one by one across the region? The evidence points to a rapid core collapse, but with long, ragged aftermaths in different areas. Perhaps the most poignant and unanswerable question is the human one. What was it truly like to live through those decades? For a merchant in Ugarit, seeing the ships of unknown peoples on the horizon. For a farmer in Anatolia, watching the soil turn to dust year after year. For a palace scribe in Pylos, putting down his stylus for the last time, knowing the world he recorded was ending. We can reconstruct systems and climates, but the individual fear, resilience, and heartbreak are echoes we can never fully hear. These persistent uncertainties are not a failure of history, but its very essence. They remind us that the past is not a solved equation, but a conversation. Each new discovery, whether a sunken ship or a translated word, is less about providing a final answer and more about teaching us to ask a better, more insightful question. The story of the Bronze Age collapse, in all its complexity and mystery, continues to evolve, and in doing so, it holds up an ever clearer mirror to our own interconnected and fragile world. While the palaces burned around the Aegean and the Levant, were other parts of the ancient world also trembling? To understand the true scale of what happened, we must lift our gaze beyond the eastern Mediterranean. Was this collapse an isolated disaster, or was it one symptom of a wider, perhaps global, fever running through the complex societies of that era? The evidence, while fragmented and not directly connected, suggests a startling synchronicity. Around the same time that the Hittite capital was abandoned and the Mycenaean palaces fell silent, great disruptions were unfolding thousands of miles away. In the fertile plains of the Yellow River, the powerful Shang dynasty in China was entering its final, violent decades. The archaeological and later textual records speak of a period of intense internal conflict, shifting capitals, and eventual overthrow by the Zhou around 1046 years before the Common Era. The precise causes are debated, involving possible environmental changes and social pressures, but the timing is undeniably close to the Mediterranean crisis. Further west, in the vast expanse of the Indus Valley, the great urban centers of the Harappan civilization, like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, had already declined centuries earlier. However, scholars note a prolonged period of deurbanization and the fading of their distinctive cultural patterns, a process some link to shifts in monsoon patterns that may have stretched across centuries, touching this later period as well. Even in Europe beyond the Mycenaean sphere, there are signs of significant change. In Central and Eastern Europe, the sophisticated and widespread Urnfield culture, known for its bronze work and ritual practices, shows evidence of population movements and increased conflict during this broad time frame. Now, it is crucial to state clearly there is no evidence of a Hittite merchant sailing to China or a Shang army marching to attack Ugarit. These were separate worlds, unaware of each other's existence. A direct chain of cause and effect linking them is not there, but the coincidence is profoundly thought-provoking. It points to a possibility that the real trigger lay not in politics or piracy alone, but in a shared planetary context. Could a prolonged period of climatic instability, a grand fluctuation in global weather patterns, have created parallel pressures on agriculture and social order in these widely separated regions? A mega-drought in the Mediterranean might have been matched by monsoon failures in Asia or altered growing seasons in Europe, each complex society, having reached a peak of population and interconnection, would have been uniquely vulnerable to such a shock. Their specific collapses looked different. The Shang fell to rebellion, the Mycenaeans to systemic failure, but the underlying stressor could have been a similar environmental pulse. This comparative view changes the story's meaning. The late Bronze Age collapse ceases to be a singular, mysterious tragedy and becomes a potential case study in a recurring historical pattern. It illustrates a sobering principle: when human civilizations build towards maximum complexity and interdependence, they often also build in maximum fragility. They become exquisitely sensitive to disruption, whether from a changing climate, internal rebellion, or the breaking of a trade route. The collapse then appears not as a random accident, but as a potential phase in the life cycle of a complex system, a moment where the scales tip from sustainable growth to cascading failure. Seeing our Bronze Age story within this wider, global frame does not diminish its drama, it deepens its relevance. It suggests we are not studying one ancient catastrophe, but observing a fundamental rhythm of history, one that echoes wherever societies become too rigid, too interconnected, or too detached from the environmental realities that ultimately support them. The silence that fell was not just in one sea, but in many hearts across the ancient world, each facing their own version of the same daunting question: what happens when the world you built can no longer weather the world you live in? The fragments of that shattered world did not simply vanish. They became the fertile soil from which our own cultural foundations grew. In the rocky, sun-drenched landscape of Greece, the utter absence of a central, palatial power created a vacuum filled by fierce local competition. Dozens of independent city-states or polis emerged, each a self-governing community centered on its own fortified hilltop, its own laws, and its own fierce sense of identity. This political fragmentation was not a weakness but a forge. The constant rivalry between places like Athens, Sparta, and Corinth drove relentless innovation in military tactics, ship design, and political organization. It was within this pressurized, competitive environment that the radical experiment of citizen-led governance could take root in Athens, and that the disciplined militarism of Sparta could be perfected. This same competitive spirit fueled a marketplace of ideas, where philosophers like Socrates could question everything, where playwrights could critique their own society on stage, and where historians like Herodotus first sought to explain the conflict between East and West. The brilliant, contentious world of classical Greece was a direct inheritance of that earlier collapse, 1,000 flowers blooming in the space left when a single, towering tree fell. Meanwhile, along the Levantine coast, the survivors of the old trading networks embarked on a journey of astonishing reach. The Phoenician cities, having weathered the storm by turning to the open sea, began a centuries-long project of colonization and connection. From their bases in Tyre and Sidon, they sailed westward, establishing outposts and full-fledged colonies from Cyprus to Sicily, North Africa, and even as far as the Iberian Peninsula. Their most enduring export was not purple dye or cedar wood, but an idea, a technology of the mind. Needing a simple, efficient way to record transactions across diverse languages, they perfected an alphabetic script, a system of just over 20 signs that could represent the basic sounds of speech. This revolutionary tool was far easier to learn than the complex syllabic scripts of the Bronze Age. As Phoenician traders set up shop across the Mediterranean, they carried this alphabet with them. The Greeks adopted and adapted it, adding vowels, and in doing so, they unlocked a new potential for recording literature, law, and philosophy. The very words you are hearing now trace their lineage back to that pragmatic mercantile script, a tool born from the necessity of a fragmented, post-collapse world. In the power vacuum left by the retreating Egyptian and Hittite empires, new identities crystallized in the hills and valleys of the Levant. Smaller, ethnically defined kingdoms like Israel, Judah, and the Aramean states of Damascus and Hamath rose to prominence. Their stories, preserved in texts like the Hebrew Bible, are deeply concerned with covenant, law, and monotheistic faith, reflecting a search for order and meaning in a landscape no longer dominated by foreign imperial giants. Their struggles and innovations in statecraft and religious thought would leave an indelible mark on later history. This resetting of the political map across the entire Eastern Mediterranean created a laboratory for new forms of social organization. The old model of the god-king presiding over a vast, tribute-based empire was largely gone, replaced by a mosaic of smaller, more nimble states constantly testing alliances and boundaries. This dynamic, multipolar world directly enabled the Iron Age revolutions in warfare, like the citizen hoplite phalanx, and in governance, from early republican ideas to refined monarchies. The collapse did not send humanity into a permanent dark age. It forced a profound and painful reboot. It cleared the monolithic structures of the past, making room for diverse, adaptive, and fiercely innovative societies to experiment with the very building blocks of civilization. The end of that interconnected Bronze Age world was not a full stop, but a brutal, necessary comma, a pause that made the next great chapter of human history possible. The stones themselves still speak if you know where to listen. For anyone moved by this story, the physical traces of that lost world are not locked away in textbooks, but stand open to the sky, waiting for visitors to walk among them. In Greece, the citadel of Mycenae remains a place of overwhelming presence. You approach through the famous Lion Gate, its massive limestone lintels still bearing the carved guardians, and enter a realm of giants. The walls are called Cyclopean for a reason, built from colossal, rough-hewn blocks that seem too large for human hands to have set in place. To stand in the heart of the granary or look down from the palace foundations across the Argolid plain is to feel the sheer ambition and power of the Wanaks who ruled here, and to grasp the staggering scale of what was later abandoned. Across the sea, on the coast of modern-day Turkey, lie the sprawling ruins of Hattusa, the Hittite capital. This was not a city that fell to a visible conqueror, but one that was quietly, completely emptied. You can walk through the monumental gateways, past the foundations of vast temples and storehouses that once held grain for an empire. the sense is not of violent destruction but of profound absence. The most evocative spots are the royal rock-cut sanctuaries at Yazilikaya, where processions of Hittite gods and goddesses are frozen in stone, a silent testament to the spiritual world that vanished with the people who worshipped here. The story of commerce and daily life is best felt at the site of Ugarit in Syria, though its accessibility remains difficult. Before recent hardships, excavations revealed a remarkably complete merchant city. You could walk along paved streets, peer into the ground floor shops and workshops of metalworkers, and stand in the archive room where the final, desperate clay tablets were found. The layout of a wealthy merchant's house with its central courtyard and private well feels intimately familiar, making the city's sudden, violent end all the more poignant. These are not just ruins, they are preserved moments in time. For those unable to travel to these regions, world-class museums hold the portable echoes of the age. In Bodrum, Turkey, the Museum of Underwater Archaeology houses the breathtaking cargo of the Uluburun Shipwreck. Seeing the stacked oxhide copper ingots, the glass ingots from Mesopotamia, and the personal belongings of the crew makes the reality of that long-distance trade instantly tangible. In the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, you can gaze upon the actual linear bead tablets from Pylos, their cryptic markings a direct link to the palace bureaucracy that vanished in fire. And on the walls of the mortuary temple of Rameses III at Luxor, Egypt, the grand reliefs of the naval battle against the Sea Peoples are still sharply carved, a pharaoh's propaganda rendered in eternal stone. Visiting these places or even viewing their treasures in museums does something a documentary or book cannot. It collapses time. You are standing where a Mycenaean scribe once tallied chariots, touching stone that a Hittite mason carefully fitted, or looking into the face of a golden statue that a merchant once packed for a perilous voyage. This tangible connection turns abstract historical forces into human stories written in landscape, artifact, and stone. It reminds us that the rise and fall of civilizations is not merely a concept, but a process etched into the very earth, waiting for us to listen and learn. Could those ancient rulers have charted a different course? It is a tantalizing thought experiment to step into the sandals of a Bronze Age king armed with our modern hindsight. If a pharaoh or a Hittite emperor could have glimpsed the future, seen the converging storms of drought, migration, and systemic failure, what actions might have saved their world? The first and most obvious intervention would be against the invisible enemy, the changing climate. With foreknowledge of the coming mega-drought, a wise ruler could have initiated vast public works, not just more temples but massive state-sponsored granaries. Imagine storehouses carved into bedrock, filled to the ceiling during decades of plenty, a strategic food reserve designed to weather not 1 but 10 lean years. This would have required a monumental shift in economic thinking, from consuming surplus on prestige projects to investing it in collective insurance. It would have meant prioritizing resilience over immediate display. The second vulnerability was the brittle supply chain. A king with our map could have worked aggressively to diversify. Instead of relying solely on Afghan tin arriving through a handful of vulnerable ports, he might have funded risky expeditions to seek new sources, perhaps in the far west, or invested in alternative technologies, experimenting earlier with iron smelting to reduce that crippling dependency on a single, distant commodity. He could have cultivated multiple trade partners for every critical good, ensuring that if one connection snapped, others could take the strain. This leads to the third, and perhaps most difficult, adjustment, the structure of power itself. The palatial command economy was a masterpiece of control, but also of fragility. To build resilience, a ruler would need to willingly decentralize. He might empower regional governors with more autonomy to respond to local crises, or foster a stronger class of independent merchants who could keep goods moving even if the palace bureaucracy faltered. This would mean sharing control, trusting local nodes within the network to act without waiting for orders from the distant, slow-moving center. Finally, he would need to become a diplomat of unprecedented skill, working tirelessly to reinforce the fraying brotherhood of kings. Instead of letting slights over missing gifts fester, he would institutionalize conflict resolution, perhaps creating a standing council of great powers to mediate disputes and coordinate responses to common threats like piracy or migration. He would understand that the strength of the web depended on the strength of every single knot. Yet here we confront the profound limitations of their age. They had no scientific framework to predict a century-long drought, only the interpretation of omens. Their social philosophy was built on a divine right to rule, not on concepts of flexible, distributed governance. The technology of the time made rapid communication over vast distances impossible. A message from Egypt to Hatti took weeks. Most fundamentally, their entire worldview was oriented toward maintaining a perfected, static order, not adapting to dynamic change. Prevention would have demanded not just different policies, but a different mind. It would have required leaders to think in terms of systems, interdependencies, and long-term risk, concepts alien to a world where authority was demonstrated through monumental stability and immediate divine favor. The exercise, therefore, is less about finding a magic solution and more about illuminating the deep constraints of their era. It shows us that their collapse was not a failure of intelligence or courage, but a failure of imagination, trapped within the very paradigms that had created their greatness. The most haunting question it leaves us with is not about them, but about our own time. What brilliant, unquestioned assumptions underpin our global system today, and would we have the courage to reimagine them before a crisis forces our hand? The clay tablet is cool in his hands, a familiar weight. The Hittite scribe works quickly in the dimming light, his stylus pressing the final inventory of treaties and grain receipts into the damp clay. Outside the archive, the sounds are wrong, the rhythmic bustle of the capital replaced by a tense, hurried silence punctuated by distant shouts. He knows the order to seal and bury the records of the empire, to hide the memory of Hattusa from whatever is coming. His work is an act of faith, a belief that someone someday will dig these words up and understand. But as he places the last tablet in the chest, a colder thought grips him. What if no one ever reads this again? What if the language itself is forgotten and these careful marks become just patterns in the dirt, as meaningless as bird tracks? He closes the lid not on archives but on a world. Far to the west, in a green valley of the Peloponnese, a farmer gathers his family. The rich bottomland soil that fed his father and his father's father now feels like a trap too exposed. For weeks, rumors have snaked up from the coast, whispers of strange ships and burning villages. The decision is a rupture in his soul. He leaves behind the stone foundation of his house, the olive trees just coming to maturity, the ancestral plot. With only what they can carry, his family joins a ragged stream of others climbing toward a high, rocky hilltop. They are not seeking a palace or a king. They are seeking a wall, any wall, between them and the horizon. His grief is not for an empire, but for the specific curve of his field at sunset, a personal geography being erased forever. On the docks of Ugarit, the air is thick with smoke and a sound that chills the blood, the roar of a crowd that is not your own. A merchant, a man who negotiated cargo prices from Crete to Babylon, stands frozen. The ships he had counted on for escape or reinforcement are ablaze in the harbor, their masts etching black lines against an orange sky. In his belt pouch, he feels the weight of a cylinder seal, his identity, his credit, his name across the trading world. It is now worthless. The intricate network of trust and contract that defined his life has vaporized in a single evening. His terror is sharpened by a devastating clarity. He understands precisely what is being lost, and that makes the chaos even more surreal. he is not witnessing a battle. He is watching an entire system of human connection being unmade in real time. Archaeology gives us these moments not in words but in silent testimony. A hoard of fine jewelry and silver cups buried hastily under the floor of a burning house in Mycenae speaks of a frantic hope to return, a hope never fulfilled. The resting place of a family group found within the rubble of a modest home in a Levantine town tells a wordless story of a final shelter taken together. These are not the grand failures of states, but the intimate tragedies of households. The emotional landscape of the collapse was a turbulent mix of profound confusion, as the predictable rhythms of seasons and trade dissolved, and deep grief for a vanishing normality. For the literate elite, there was the added horror of historical awareness, the dreadful understanding that they were living through an ending. This shift in perspective, from empires to individuals, changes everything. It reminds us that historical processes are not abstract forces. They are the accumulated choices and sufferings of millions of people facing the unimaginable. Their resilience was not about rebuilding palaces, but about the simple, staggering act of carrying on. The farmer on his hilltop planting seeds in rocky soil, the scribe's descendant who might one day learn a new way to write, the merchant's child who remembers stories of the sea. These people carried fragments of the old world in their hands and memories. They were the bridge. Their struggle to make sense of the collapse, to find meaning in survival, is what ultimately connects their distant epoch to our own. We recognize in them not just ancient victims, but ourselves, facing the universal human challenge of finding solid ground when the world itself seems to be falling away. The final act of their story was not an end, but a transformation. The rise and fall of the Bronze Age's first globalized world stands as a profound reminder that no civilization, no matter how brilliant or interconnected, is a permanent fixture of history. We have journeyed from the dazzling peak of palatial power, where kings exchanged gifts as brothers across continents, through the perfect storm of a changing climate, deep social strain, and catastrophic network failure, to the stark, fragmented world that slowly emerged from the silence. This entire arc challenges one of our most comforting myths, the idea of linear and inevitable progress. It shows us with startling clarity that complexity itself carries the seeds of its own fragility. A system optimized for maximum efficiency under stable conditions can become dangerously brittle when those conditions shift. The very connections that create wealth and culture can, in a crisis, become conduits for spreading scarcity and fear. Yet, this is not solely a tale of loss. It is equally a testament to human resilience and relentless adaptation. From the ashes of centralized palaces grew the fiercely independent city-states of Greece, the mercantile networks of the Phoenicians, and the new kingdoms of the Levant. These societies, forged in a harder world, experimented with novel forms of politics, warfare, and identity. They carried forward fragments of the old, like the alphabet born from mercantile necessity, and built upon them something different, often more flexible and in many ways more enduring. The collapse was a brutal filter, and what survived was not a replica of the past, but a set of blueprints for a different future. As we navigate our own era of profound interconnection and global challenge, this ancient mystery serves as a vital guide. It is not a prophecy of inevitable doom, but a clear-eyed call to examine the foundations of our own world. It asks us to consider whether we are building systems that are merely efficient or truly resilient. Are we valuing short-term optimization over long-term stability? Have we created redundancies, or have we stretched our supply chains and social contracts too thin? The lesson is not to retreat from connection, but to fortify it with wisdom, to remember that the strength of a network lies not just in its density, but in the ability of its individual parts to withstand a shock. If you found this deep dive into history's echoes fascinating, Consider subscribing for more journeys into the past that illuminate our present. And we would love to hear your perspective. What parallel between that ancient world and our own strikes you the most?